In Brazil specifically, there is this, what many people would call a conflict between nature and forest preservation and agricultural production. I tend to try to move from calling it a conflict to actually nexus, because we'll only find a solution if we manage to have these two sectors working together. Within Clever, since it's focused on trade impact on biodiversity, I had the opportunity to study a case study, which is the policy on EU regulation on deforestation-free products. This is a really interesting regulation because it's the first time that a consumer region understood, okay, for us to reduce our global impact on deforestation and land degradation, we need to have some type of regulation with regards to our trade of what is imported into our region, because it is companies in these producer countries that need to then adapt, readjust, and understand, oh, how do I need to comply to be able to sell now my commodities to the EU, which depending on the commodity is quite a big market. This policy, which actually comes from abroad, a transnational regulation, is going to be implemented nationally. And in Brazil, there are already other policies being implemented, right? So, for example, the National Forest Code, which is an example of public policies, and there's also other types of private regulations, such as the Amazon soy moratorium or even other certification standards. An interesting case is with regards to the Amazon soy moratorium, which is a private regulation because it started with companies and NGOs coming together to decide, okay, we need to produce soy that doesn't cause deforestation, and this since 2006. And the government agencies are also part of its monitoring. So it's actually a hybrid type of governance. The EUDR has a different cutoff date, and that's one specific regulatory requirement that actually comes into conflict with the requirements already in place for the Amazon soy moratorium, because it has a cutoff date of 2008. It means that actually there's this gap of 12 years where companies are now understanding, well, should we change the cutoff dates? Because actually many producers, since the beginning of the Amazon soy moratorium, have been against this regulation because they say, look, this is beyond national regulation, such as the Forest Code, which actually lets a certain percentage of deforestation to be able to use the land for other purposes. And so now this interaction is being studied because it can actually threaten the Amazon soy moratorium. And recently we heard that Cargill, one of the biggest companies that's signatory of the Amazon soy moratorium, actually changed its cutoff date. So albeit the EUDR, this EU regulation, being innovative and having a positive objective, overall objective in terms of reducing deforestation, it is interesting to understand what can be these unintended consequences when it's actually implemented on national soil, and especially with regards to other policies that are already in place. So what have I learned? When trying to regulate land use for most sustainable outcome, it's interesting to think if you'd rather regulate specific supply chains, meaning specific commodities that are being produced, or have more of a place-based regulation. What does that mean? A regulation that's about the territory, not specifically the commodity that's being produced. A territorial regulation may have a better sustainable outcome because you avoid leakage. So when you're, for example, regulating just one supply chain, you're making sure that that supply chain is deforestation-free or have another sustainable characteristic that you wish. However, it doesn't mean that then maybe there's a production on the side, or there's even soy production in another territory that's being done in an unsustainable way. Why? Because the producers that are being regulated, they'll either comply, so either be able to follow the regulation, or they'll move. And in this moving, they'll end up doing that same practice which we didn't want somewhere else. Something else I learned in this policy interaction research between the EUDR and national policies in Brazil is that inevitably in an international or transnational regulation, whenever it's trying to be put into place nationally, there'll be an issue of sovereignty and legitimacy. And this is anywhere in the world, because countries in the end have their own interests, and they'll say that they also have their own rights to do whatever they want with their land. So this is not a matter of saying, oh, so transnational regulations shouldn't exist. No, but it's a matter to having that into account, that whenever there is a transnational regulation that will impact what's going on nationally in other countries, to have in mind what's already happening in that country, not to undermine maybe also already a lot of work that's being put into place. So for example, a transnational regulation could help the national context to be able to implement it, rather than bringing in other types of requirements. And the last learning while studying these policy interactions is that rather than saying, okay, a public regulation is more important, something legally binding is better or has more impact than something that is non-legally binding, like certification or a sectoral agreement, is not necessarily the case. I don't think it needs to be choosing one or the other, but rather that you need to have all the actors being part of the different regulations. It's the only way for you actually to have the sustainable outcome. It's a matter of just making sure that we have the amount of land being used and produced in the most sustainable way for the next generations. Right?